that.
Mhm.
And you should get that notification. There we go. So as I said, my name's Lane Sturdivant. Pronouns are they, them. I work for the league, and so I'm going to facilitate tonight, but we also have two folks who have offered to attend and share some stories, specific examples of overcoming challenges in trying to take action for local change. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute, but I thought that what we could do first, and I'll throw my agenda into the chat. Let's see. I already threw it in, but I don't think some of you can see it. So there we go. So I figured that first we could start with John and Elizabeth for intros, but before they share their stories, we could probably just go around and everybody could share their intros unless you're off mic because you're eating, in which case, you know, you can just say skip in the chat and we can go ahead and skip you, knowing that it is dinner time. But I was hoping that people could share their names, your pronouns if you'd like, where you're zooming in from, like you did in the chat. But I'd also really love to hear a fun fact about your community, if you can come up with one on the spot. So I'll start. I'm zooming in from Warren in the Mid-Coast. And a fun fact about Warren is that the town, I think in the 1800s, opened up a pound for alewives. So they were catching alewives from the river because Warren is on the St. George River. And the revenue from the town selling those alewives was what funded the original firehouse. So I think that's fun. Who would like to go next?
I can go.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm from Ellsworth, Ellsworth High School. I'm a junior there. And one fun fact about Ellsworth community, there's this really old rich guy named who owns the Black House, which is now known as Woodlawn in Ellsworth. And a very rarely known fact about him that wasn't taught, even though we've gone to Woodlawn like every single year for field trips since I was in like kindergarten, is that he was gay and had a gay lover, and I think helped with the opening of the Ellsworth Public Library.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I should also amend and say it doesn't have to be fun. It could be a serious fact too, but whatever you'd like to share about your community. Judy, did you want to go?
Well, I was just saying that that's a fact. I live in Ellsworth, Judy Lyles. I live in Ellsworth. I never knew that. That's fascinating to me. You know, one of the things I find interesting about Ellsworth, because we haven't lived here that long, is, you know, to me, it is the gateway to Acadia, but there's a real resistance to being called the gateway to Acadia. So I just thought I'd throw that out. It's an interesting part of the community. Yeah, I am. That's it.
Yeah, we could have a whole other conversation
About that.
About how people view
why not
community.
capitalize on that? But just saying, we don't. All right.
Thanks, Judy. Who would like to go next?
I'll go. This is Mary speaking. I live in Portland with she, her pronouns, and I'm going to cheat and give a fact about myself that I am kind of grappling with and I find intensely interesting. Before the pandemic, I was a really active community member. I had stopped working. I was serving at one point on one state commission, 2 city commissions, and 2 boards. And I've drawn back. And now my idea of community is to join a group on Zoom. And soon enough, I'll put myself on, I'll join with video. And then you'll see me cooking my supper before my next Zoom meeting. But I do not have an exit plan that's COVID based. And I'm loving lots of time to myself, but I am also looking forward to what might come next.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Mary.
Sure.
Well, I can go. John Broad again, he, him pronouns, and I live along the Presumpscot River in Falmouth in land that was originally Wabanaki land. And it's one of the first territories where Europeans settled in this area, where it actually was considered part of Portland at that time. And there are a lot of, sort of artifacts going back many, many years around this neighborhood, both from the Wabanaki time and from the early European colonists' time. One day I'd like to learn a lot more about all of that, but it's all around us here along the Presumpscot River.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I should say that in Maine, as in most places in the United States, our local governments are built on, settler colonial sort of governments, and there is that history to contend with here. So thanks for acknowledging that. Allison, did you want to share?
Sure. I'm from Beaver Cove, and I haven't lived here very long, just a few years, but I'm now on the select board because I was the last one out of the room when the vote was taken. And I know I'm excited. I really like grassroots democracy, and I think it's not necessarily fun, but I think it's kind of interesting that Beaver Cove ends up being the leader in our emergency operations plan for all of Piscataquis County. We have 95 full-time residents, but it's fun because I'm involved in it, and I worked in embassies overseas. I was a U.S. diplomat, and it's a lot of what I did in the State Department is really mirrored in the emergency operations plan. I had no idea that each county has one, the state, all connected nationally with a uniform communication system. Very impressive.
Wow. All right. We're learning new things on this Zoom already. Thank you for sharing, everybody. I'm just going to shout out to Evan, who put their comment into the chat. They're in the West End of Portland, and an interesting thing about the neighborhood is that there's so many LGBTQIA folks here that every other building on my block has at least one Progress Pride flag being used as a window curtain.
Wow.
And we have one more person joining us, which is good timing. So hi Maggie, thanks for joining. We were just doing some intros, so if you want to put your name, pronouns, and where you're zooming in from into the chat, you're welcome to do so. But I was going to move us along I wanted to put a poll, and hopefully this will work. Some of you might be familiar with the idea of polls in Zoom. I'm just launching this, so you should see a poll called Unexpected Challenges, and this would be more effective with a larger Zoom participation rate, but I think that it's still a fun technology to try to use, and it's anonymous. So the question is, have you experienced an unexpected challenge in taking action to create community change? So there's plenty of expected challenges. I think we can talk about those as well. But I'm particularly curious to hear if people have experienced anything unexpected in the process of trying to take some local action to create change in your community. So if you want to answer, I see 4 people have answered. I'm going to leave it up for just another second. Here we go. All right. And it won't let me answer, I guess, apparently. So I will end it there. So as I said, this would be a bit more statistically interesting if we had more folks, but it's still interesting. Kind of throw that in there. So about half of you, just over half of you said you have, and another 3 out of 7 who responded said you hadn't. So that's a good mix. Moving on, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have John and Elizabeth here who both offered to share a story from their specific experience in trying to take local action and the challenges that they faced in that process. And John and Elizabeth, you can tell us whether or not those challenges were expected or unexpected. And you can also tell us sort of where you are in the process of taking that local action, whether it was successful or you're still working on it, or how it ended, if that challenge was something that could not be overcome. So I don't know if either of you want to go first.
I don't mind going first.
Great.
If that's good. Okay. Okay. Well, it's really nice to see you all here, and this is a really important conversation. And I think I just to start out with a few high level thoughts that occur to me before I talk about my particular experience. But one thing is that you really can make a big difference in local policy and local practice. Lots of people pay very little attention to what's going on locally, local rules and laws and budgets. The three areas I think that have the most focus locally, property taxes, education, and land use and planning. By no means are those the most, the only important things, but those are the things that take up the most time and energy. And those are things where people kind of sometimes have an interest, a strong interest, and sometimes less of a strong interest. But some people locally can pay a lot of attention to these things, and sometimes a very few people can make a lot of waves and have a large impact locally. And that's something that I've noticed in every town, even Lewiston, Portland, Bangor, larger cities, all the way down to smaller towns. So this is like one of the best examples of the adage that those who show up get to make the rules. I mean, it really does pay to show up, and it's amazing how few people can actually, it really takes to make a difference, to lift up an issue, to engage the community, and to make some change locally. So it's a really important and timely topic that we're talking about here. Although I live in Portland, I live in Falmouth, I'm going to talk about Portland and a ballot question that we've been working on in Portland for literally over 3 years now, to create a clean elections program for the city of Portland. And we decided to do this by using a charter amendment, because we thought that putting something into the charter would give it the most long-term protection against the year-to-year vicissitudes of politics and whether there should be funded. And, we thought it would really protect it and make it permanent so that it doesn't get caught up in the campaign cycle, and that it really becomes an enduring feature. And we started off extremely well. We had a really difficult task of gathering 6,000, almost 7,000 signatures in just 90 days. It's just very, very difficult. And it's literally like 10% of the entire population. We had to get their signatures in just 90 days. It's hard enough to get signatures of 10% of the state population in a year and a half, but to get 10% in the city in that period of time was really challenging. But we did it with a combination of really hardworking volunteers and a few people who got paid a little bit. But we blasted out with a great start on a campaign. And then this is where the challenges came in. A few people in municipal government weren't crazy about the idea, and began a series of legal maneuvers to prevent us from going to the ballot. And I'll spare you, what could be an entire first year law school class, but I'll just say it's 3 years later and we still have not gotten our issue placed directly on the ballot, but we certainly have learned a lot. And indirectly, our experience led to the formation of the Charter Commission that's now examining, Portland government at a very deep level, and making a lot of recommendations and possible changes that have nothing to do with clean elections. They're all over the place in terms of the structure of the city and the role of the city council and city manager and the mayor. And it's really opened up quite a conversation that was effectively an unintended consequence of something that we started 3 years ago. And in the course of this work, we've identified a lot of allies and supporters, and we've learned a lot about how the municipal, sort of the incumbent power structure in the city reacts to the public when the public comes forward, even in a city that's remarkably progressive politically. When the public comes forward, there is an instinctive reaction to protect their own authority and discretion and turf within the city hall. And we ran right into that. And it's been a fascinating experience. And we're still confident that ultimately we'll be there, we'll get there. I think one of the takeaways is it requires a lot of hard work, a lot of diligence, and in some cases, just a lot of patience. As these things move slowly, they grind slowly when you get caught up in a combination of city council actions and legal actions in court, which could happen anytime that there's opposition to something you want to do. And of course, almost anything that you want to do that's worth doing, will engender some resistance and some opposition. We've had a really good building experience here, and I think it has laid the foundation for the Fair Elections Portland organization and for building alliances and coalition support that can endure and can be available to work on other projects in the future, just because of the relationships and the trust that's been built up among people that have pitched in on this particular issue. So I have I've actually kind of listed out a lot of the challenges and the opportunities that anyone could face, when taking up a municipal issue, an issue for reform locally. But I'll save that until other people have talked. Maybe I'll kind of share that with you a little bit later on. And of course, I'm happy to take any questions, or we can just go to Elizabeth if that's better.
Thanks, John. If folks don't mind holding their questions, because I'm thinking there might be questions that are aimed at both of you, if there are any common themes in your stories. But we'll definitely have time after Elizabeth shares for anyone with questions. So, Elizabeth?
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. So my story is going to kind of be about a rainbow crosswalk painting in downtown Ellsworth. It was first kind of started to get planned my freshman year of high school. I had not yet joined the group that did it, the GSCA at my high school. I had not joined at that point yet, but I had started to work on it a little bit following that. But yeah, we brought it to city council with kind of high hopes, but kind of doubting that it would get passed. But in the process, we also got crosswalks at our high school and middle school in Ellsworth that were rainbow crosswalks, and we have those both still, and we've been painting those every year. We don't even have to pay the janitors for it because students volunteer and do it. And then, but yeah, August, I think it was 2020, I think, or 2019, sorry. Wait, no, 2020, I was right there. Sorry. I think it's kind of hard to, it was my end of my freshman year. In August, it was brought to city council. Finally, it had been waiting for like months at that point. And it's brought to city council in Ellsworth, and a lot of the concerns that were brought up were not necessarily true or had really any impact on it. There was a lot of safety concerns that colors would be distracting to drivers, which had been proven wrong with a DOT, which has approved those, the main DOT has. And yeah, there's a lot of issues for safety. One of the city councilors is like, oh, I walk down Main Street every day, and I know I wouldn't feel safe with that because it's hard enough walking downtown or something like that. And yeah, basically along those lines. A lot of the counselors were, oh, if we do it for this group, we have to do it for every group. And they didn't want to end up doing it for a bad group. And and kind of our response to that was, well, you're the city council, you get to decide what image you want to project for the city, kind of thing. But at that city council meeting, it was struck down 3-3 with 1 abstaining. So there was not enough to pass it. And I guess that was one of the unexpected challenges, but was that people can abstain and not give an opinion. And it's very unexpected as well, because that particular counselor had put a poll out on her Facebook page or something like that and said, I will vote however the poll goes. And 80% of the poll had ended up giving support for the Rainbow Crosswalk downtown. So I guess that was one of the unexpected challenges. That's kind of where our challenges began. It went to committee. Basically, they decided that the leaders of the GSDA at that time, the seniors of president, vice president, and teacher from the Ellsworth High School GSDA would be on a committee with 3 of the counselors. But unfortunately, the committee died out because one of the counselors is unwilling to look at any of the data that my advisor provided. He wasn't listening to reason in general, and they weren't willing to work on anything really. However, from this, we got a lot of community support. The local businesses all began to fly rainbow and progress pride flags in this outside their businesses. And later that year, they sold pride masks and Ellsworth Pride stickers that we used to fund a Pride Fest last year. So we were able to not only get the Rainbow Crosswalks at the high school and the middle school, but we were also able to set up a Pride Fest for our entire city to celebrate Pride during June last year. But yeah, it was super exciting, and we ended up being able to even put on a bigger show of Pride was really awesome. But we didn't kind of leave it there. We kept going, of course. So after the Pride Fest, and we basically kind of started getting back to the drawing board, like, what can we do to fix this and figure out what we can address their concerns without giving them validity, if that makes sense, because a lot of the concerns weren't valid, but they needed to be addressed if we were going to go anywhere. So basically we started planning on which street we could put it on in order to address the traffic concerns, and then if there were new arguments we should put forth and new ways to try to reach the counselors. At the previous meeting that August, there were only a few, it was on Zoom, so there's only a few students there, and it was hard to kind of get your word in. So it was very difficult to really get the student perspective. And at this next meeting, that was a couple months ago actually, we got a lot of more student voices. So basically you plan to do it on Franklin Street, that is adjacent to Main Street in Ellsworth. So, and it is a parklet during the summer months, which means there's zero traffic on that road during that time, which was really awesome. So I guess one of the challenges is you have to make compromises even when you think the reasoning isn't validated in any manner. So we moved it, that's where we gave made that our official spot we wanted to put it. And then we also started reaching out to the people around us and trying to get more support that we could have at that meeting to show that it's not just us, not just a couple teenagers at the high school who want some rainbow paint on the sidewalks. It's a lot of adults. So before the meeting, which I think was in March, February maybe, really bad at time if you cannot figure it out. But yeah, and then we reached out to a lot of the downtown businesses, wondering if they would be willing to send a representative to kind of talk about how it could benefit their business. We saw last year with the selling of rainbow masks and stickers, it was able to give the businesses a lot of business and increase the tourism downtown, because our town, well, our city is really dependent on on the way to Bar Harbor is kind of our whole scheme to get money, to be honest. But yeah, and so we had a lot of them there. We reached out through Facebook and social media to other community members, asking them to show up and show support, because otherwise we're not going to get it through. And we also set up private meetings with each of the counselors we thought we could turn to our side, because there's two that there's no way they're going to change their minds. It wasn't even worth seeing them. We were just going to get obscenities kind of yelled at us. But yeah, so we met with 3 of the counselors. One of them was trying to strategize because they were sponsoring our plan, and then 2 others were to convince them and try to talk through them and get through to them with communication, which I guess is another challenge, is that even though you don't agree with someone, you have to talk it out to get to the bottom of the issue. But yeah, one of the counselors was focused on business. We focused on business and how it could improve revenue for the downtown businesses and save the city money, because they didn't have to paint that crosswalk. We were paying for it. We have a grant for it, which was one of the big convincing factors, I think, in the end, was that the city doesn't have to pay any more money for it. We had a grant. And then with the other counselor, she basically emailed us saying, I want to hear the stories about the struggles from all of your queer students. I'm tired of politics, and I just want to hear the emotions from these students. So basically we went there and told her our sob stories, because that was the only way to get through to her at that point. She was kind of getting to the end of her term, and she decided that she's probably not going to run for re-election next year. So she just wanted to talk to us instead. So the day of the council meeting, we kind of get there and we go through our arguments, we present our plan and all of the advantages it goes through. And then surprisingly enough, our outreach worked. It really worked. We had, the entire room was filled. There's people standing outside waiting for the turns to speak, because the room was just not big enough for everyone. It was really awesome. So we had a lot of community support that came in and talked. We had a couple people from our Constitution Hall who came in and expressed that we were sinners, murderers, and enemies of the state. That was the only really negative views they gave us. But fortunately, we got to the point where they voted and we did get it passed. We are getting it painted this summer. We have to just wait for the street sweepers to kind of handle all of that, and we get it painted this summer, hopefully before June. But yeah, I guess really one of the overcoming challenges is you have to keep pushing, because eventually you'll kind of gain traction and get people in your community to support you. Yeah, that's kind of all I got.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and congrats.
Yeah.
Excited to go to Ellsworth just to go hunt that down.
Yeah.
After it's painted. So yeah, why don't we take a few minutes if folks have questions for either John or Elizabeth or both, or folks wanted to comment on any sort of like themes they heard in the stories. And then I think we can kind of transition into a more general discussion where we can incorporate these stories that we heard, but also other examples that we have as we talk about the types of challenges people might face in local action, and then also like the resources and strategies to address them. So before we get into that discussion, does anybody have any questions for John or Elizabeth? Yeah, Maggie? You're muted.
How did you know that one council member was sort of possible changed her mind. Did she express that to you directly, or did she write it?
Well, we had spoken to the counselors earlier that year in that committee that kind of died out, and we knew that since Michelle Kaplan, for those who live in the Ellsworth area know her, she had abstained the first time, so we knew she was able to be swayed and was not totally sure. And then there's another counselor who had previously said no pretty harshly, but they were kind of willing to talk about it. We emailed them and he was like, I'm not 100% sure either way. I want to hear from your students, basically. And we met with him as well.
So it was really engaging with those people in particular, the ones who were so sorry about it. Go ahead, Judy.
Yeah. I have a question for Elizabeth. I wondered, this was a tremendous process, and do you have a sense of what really tipped the scale for you? Was it the one-to-one meetings with the counselors who wanted to hear more, or was it the business community? I mean, or was it a combination? But if there was one thing that you would really recommend to the next group that has a real mission in there, that they would like to accomplish, what would you say they should do?
I would suggest the one-on-one, because eventually that was what convinced Michelle Kaplan to go to our side. Sharing the personal stories that we had with our difficulties with coming out and the hardships that the LGBTQ community has to go through on a daily basis. That's what really convinced her that, yeah, we need to support this community one way or another. And I mean, I guess that's kind of what you have to do, is kind of target the people you think you can talk to and have a good conversation with, and then just really talk to them and kind of don't focus on what you want to talk about and all the data and everything. Like, be willing to share stories and kind of figure out what they want to talk about too, what their like political platform was, because we knew hers was that she was a nurse, she was a doctor, and she was for like mental health and helping fight the war against drugs and stuff. So that was a really big thing for her, and we were able to use that to our advantage.
Thank you.
Allison?
John, what was the initial issue that you were trying to get done?
Yeah, what was happening is there were people in Portland who observed that there was more and more money flooding into races for mayor and for city council mostly, and to some extent other races, but there was more and more money was coming from special interests, you might say, specific interest groups or industries or political action committees. And they were using money to, exert an influence over city government, or at least creating that impression. And this was what gave rise to the desire to do a clean elections type program for the city of Portland. And, over the last, 12 years, there was, changes in the way elections were run, and there was changes in the role of the mayor. And of course, now there's the whole charter commission. So there's been just a lot of focus on the dynamics of the elections in Portland and politics. And that brought, attention to the money that was being spent. And a lot of people were familiar with the clean elections program for legislative races. Almost every legislator in Portland has always used clean elections for their state race. And, people were just asking, why can't we do this at the municipal level also? And so as I was trying to explain, the support was great. The support of the public was great. That was the easy part. The hard part was the bureaucratic resistance and the inertia, which manifested itself in these legal challenges, which we're still struggling with. But we still think that the support is there after all these years. I still believe that whenever it comes up for a vote, the public will support it. And we now are organized to be able to participate more in things like the continued evolution of ranked choice voting and possibly consideration of proportional ranked choice voting and other kinds of election forms that can sort of build on the same base.
Because I see a connection, well, there are probably many connections, but a connection between your story and Elizabeth's, in that when you talk about bureaucratic inertia, I mean, somebody's the boss of the bureaucrats, right? So were there actually people within the bureaucracy who were purposely holding this up, or were these elected officials who blamed it on the bureaucracy but didn't push people?
Well, in our case of Portland, the answer to that question is sort of shrouded in mystery. The first thing we know was that before any of this happened, we do know that John Jennings, then the city manager, who, you know, was reputed to sort of run City Hall, I guess, he spoke out. He said he didn't want clean elections for the city of Portland. And, you know, the attorneys who work in the city, I think they were very close to Mr. Jennings, and they, my impression is that they sort of took that as, you know, sort of what he wanted them to do was to fight this. And that started down this pathway of them not putting it on the ballot, even though we had more signatures than any municipal campaign in Maine history for a ballot question. And the city attorneys were very successful in persuading the city council that, you know, that this was a legal question, not a people question, a popular question. And once the city council, this is one of the takeaways that I got, was that the city council, when the lawyers come in and start saying, no, this is a legal matter, that, you know, sometimes the city council gives up and just says, oh, well, you're lawyers, I don't know, you know, what to do about that. So they just kind of lose their fight. And, you know, you have to kind of, when the lawyers come in and start saying things like that and shutting things down, it's good to have a strategy to try to fight back, because that can be a conversation stopper, because people are afraid of lawyers, they're afraid of lawsuits, and you know, they don't know how to fight back when somebody says something like that. It's kind of shifts the conversation and makes the grassroots organizing a lot harder to do, and harder to overcome that kind of opposition.
That's really interesting. And you did a list of takeaways that you're going to share.
Yeah, I'm happy to share if you want. I mean, I just did, you know, I don't know if any of you all have done a strategic planning where you do SWOT, the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. And I sort of did the, you know, opportunities and threats or challenges. But the challenges, you know, that you would want to look at is who's going to lose from your proposal, whose life is going to be made more difficult, like in the bureaucracy, who will lose money, who will lose maybe property value, who could lose commercial or investment value in your city or your town. You know, lots of local issues can impact privacy interests. So who might stand up on that kind of a dimension? And then ideological dimensions. I mean, who's going to object and fight against you because they feel it's ideologically or politically objectionable? But the opportunities to overcome those challenges. And I think a lot of people on this webinar have been involved in organizing, but I'll just kind of run through them. That, you reach out to allied individuals, you recruit allies, you start up an organization, you share the responsibility and the workload with other people. You do research, you do at least a landscape assessment of, what is the history of this issue in the town? What are the centers of power and where will they line up on this? You build a coalition, you talk to businesses, large and small, you talk to nonprofits. Neighborhood associations are often a really good place to start organizing something. You talk to elected officials, ask them for your endorsement, make them pay attention to you, bird dog them a little bit, and until they get to know the issue and know that you're there. Obviously, you talk to media, do public comment at government meetings. You can talk to educators and, in schools or higher education institutions, faith organizations, issue organizations, political organizations that might be in your community, or even state organizations that might be interested in taking a stand. You go to local gathering places, coffee shops, transfer station, libraries, sporting venues. You just organize, you spread the word, you talk to people, you speak out when you can. I'm also a big fan of planning. I'm a fan of doing a plan for a little campaign locally and figuring out step by step, what do you need to do? Set yourself some goals and milestones, and even a little budget if you can. Be efficient, target, build momentum. And then you can kind of keep your movement going to take on other challenges after you win your first one. So there's a lot of opportunities.
Well, thank you very much. If you have taken the trouble to write some of that down, and if you're willing to share it, I think it would be, I
Sure.
would love to see it.
Yeah, I was going to ask John if you can send that around in an email. I can get it out to everyone who registered for this workshop as a resource for people. And Elizabeth, did you have something to add on to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna add that, yeah, local media is your friend. Get them to talk about you, and lots of people will know about you. We use the Ellsworth American, and had, I think, WDEA also talked about us a little bit. Having them talk about you means you're going to get the word out around your community, because everyone reads the local paper at least a little bit, and it always gets shared around on Facebook. At least in the Ellsworth area, it gets very popular very fast. And yeah, the other thing, reach out to your resources, like media, use social media too. Like, I know it's like supposed to be a bad thing, but when you're trying to organize, it's a really great way to reach out to a lot of people very quickly. And yeah, certainly reach out to businesses. That's kind of what I was gonna restate, because those are the people who are going to be able to convince your city council of things, or whatever else they're called. There's lots of different names for them, but because those are the people who have the monetary power, and a lot of the voters want to support small businesses, and if small businesses support something, they're going to support that too. Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's great. What John was saying about making a plan, that was sort of the topic of our second workshop in this series, the one that Evan ran last week. So we can share some resources about that, like planning stage as well. And so we can get out the materials that John was referencing that he's written up, and then also some of the planning sort of materials. We have about 10 minutes left. I was going to use some time to have a discussion using a Jamboard for folks who are visual learners. It's kind of a way of like virtually post-it note, onto a shared board. I'm thinking though that what John and Elizabeth have already shared was a lot of that brainstorming that I would have asked us all to put on post-it notes. So instead we might just sort of wait and have John's list. But I did want to use the last few minutes. I think that I'm curious to hear from anyone else about an example of a challenge that you faced in trying to take local action and how you overcame it, or in any themes that you've pulled from John and Elizabeth's stories or from your own experiences. You know, one theme that I kept thinking about when John and Elizabeth were talking was persistence and patience. And how even local action, you might be like, oh, it's going to be so easy to get this done because it's such a small ask. You know, even that, you know, Elizabeth, you were telling us that it took years to get the crosswalk or the colored sidewalk, the rainbow colored sidewalk. And, you know, that's kind of what I would think of as a small ask. But that local government, like a lot of government, works slowly, and that the resistance is something that it takes time to strategize and overcome. So that was a theme that I picked up. But I just wanted to open up the last 10 minutes to anybody who had comments about common themes that they'd heard, or anybody who wanted to contribute their own story or example to this discussion.
I would just say that it's really clear you can't communicate too much, can you? Whether it's with the business group or whoever you need to contact. I mean, it's been my own experience in other areas that you kind of cringe and you think, oh my gosh, you know, I don't want to have to talk to somebody about this, but not talking is the wrong decision. I mean, you always have to put your needs and your agenda forward and talk it out with people, whatever it might be. And I think that came through with both of John and Elizabeth. That's, you know, just a takeaway.
Good point.
Mm-hmm.
I think direct communication with not only with allies, but John, I liked your, I mean, I love your whole idea about, you know, and it became a much bigger process, and it might end up being a much more effective, you know, in the long term, much more effective outcome. I was curious though, we probably all run into, in various contexts, the issue of quote unquote experts versus our own instincts. And in this case, it's lawyers. And I have huge respect for lawyers, but I wondered if you ever talked one-on-one with the lawyers themselves.
Well, that's a good question. And one of the frustrations, I'll admit, one of the frustrations of our work in Portland has been that it has been very tense and you know, almost a little personal between the lawyers. And there's also been, you know, what we wanted to do was to be able to talk to the city council and get our perspective over to the city council members, but we were not really given much of an opportunity to do that. And when you're in a lawsuit, they don't really let you talk to the other side without their lawyers present. So we had some of those kinds of problems. But I do believe in you know, sort of resolving conflict creatively and constructively where it's possible and exploring that. But sadly, my profession is not very good at that. And we haven't been able to make much headway in terms of compromise or, you know, sort of some kind of partial outcome that would have, you know, I mean, we both think that this is going on the ballot, that the clean election proposal is going on the ballot. So you'd think we could be able to just sit down and say, all right, well, let's just make it happen. But so far, we just haven't been able to do that.
Well, my sympathies, because when you have an organized or even a small but very influential group of people who are determined to put the kibosh on what you're doing, that's the worst. That's the hardest. I'll just share very briefly an experience in Rutland, Vermont, when Rutland was going to bring in Syrian refugees. And before Trump shut the immigration down, they had an incredible community support for it. And my husband and I were involved at a distance, but one of the big, this reminds me a lot of Elizabeth's story. John, I think yours is more like, you know, it's more like an organizational opposition. It's a little different to me. And Elizabeth's story is about people who are afraid, people who have misconceptions, people who have, we're talking about very human instincts, good or bad. But, and it sounds like Elizabeth did something that was critically important, which was in that case to talk to people from a personal, on a personal level. And this is what happened in Rutland. There was a block of the city council in Rutland that was absolutely adamantly opposed to having Syrian refugees come in, because they had heard about crime on the part of some refugees in Germany who were North African, not Syrian. But I understand, because there was, you might remember, there was basically a riot in Germany at one point with some North African refugees. It was very frightening. And then lots and lots of misconceptions about Arabs. So what they did was they found, my husband is an expert on Syria, and we have Syrian friends in the United States. So we actually brought one of our Syrian friends to a city council meeting there. It was a special meeting so they could ask the Syrian questions, and just ask the questions and that they were concerned about. To someone who's lived in the Arab world, some of the questions might sound ridiculous. To someone who is in the gay community, some of the questions and concerns might sound ridiculous, or whether you're in or not in the gay community, but they were real. They were real fears, whether or not they sound ridiculous to you. And it was really great to have someone who was able to respond at a personal level and with the expertise. So I think that kind of productive confrontation is really critical. And the discussion last night about communication was very helpful to me, because that's something you can watch out for from the beginning and not just dismiss as marginal. You know, you need to really be careful not to dismiss as marginal the views which may be minority or may sound ridiculous. Maybe try to address those right up front.
Thanks for sharing. That's a really interesting example. And I love that phrase, like productive confrontation, which, you know, sounds like what you were able to help do in that Rutland example, and what Elizabeth and those students working with Elizabeth were able to do as well. And I really also like what you teased out about the different types of opposition. And it's almost like we should have like a 201 version of the workshop where we just talk about how do we tailor our strategies to each type of opposition. So, you know, in some cases where it's misconceptions by the public, maybe we need a public forum, and maybe we need someone who can share a personal empathetic story and answer questions. That sounds like a great strategy. And then in John's case, it's a different kind of opposition. So there's a legal strategy instead. There's kind of a creative strategy around the Charter Commission instead, as kind of getting around the legal roadblocks. So that was really interesting. Thanks for sharing, Allison.
Yeah.
Elizabeth?
I guess one connection I was making between our stories is that it kind of evolved into something more. Like, at least in Ellsworth, we founded Ellsworth Pride, a independent organization from the schools. We didn't have to get like superintendent permission to do stuff anymore. Then we also put on the first Ellsworth Pride Festival in our town, which was not something that would have ever happened beforehand. And we ended up getting rainbow banners on Main Street as like you can't have a crosswalk, but maybe this will make you stop bothering us for a little while. And kind of John seemed to have like several groups kind of pop up from his proposal and kind of advance free elections in some other ways, and to get more support on his side from new organizations. And yeah, that was kind of one of the things I picked up on.
That's probably a good place to leave it, and I think that that's a really great and optimistic way to leave it too, is the idea that in addressing a challenge, sometimes you end up seeding new opportunities or growth in your community, and like some new coalitions, new support, etc. I see John has already emailed me the what he was sharing about opportunities and threats. So what I'll do is tomorrow I will forward this information to everyone who's registered and attended tonight. And so thank you all for joining us, and thanks especially to John and Elizabeth for sharing your stories.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you
good night,
very
everyone.
much. Nice moderation too.
Yeah.